There is a reason this message found you tonight. Not because an algorithm pushed it toward you, and not because you randomly clicked on another video while trying to escape your thoughts for a few minutes. Something inside you has been searching for language that could explain the strange feeling you have been carrying lately. The sensation that your life has stopped moving while the rest of the world keeps accelerating. The feeling that doors keep closing without explanation, that people disappear without warning, and that the version of yourself you used to rely on no longer works the way it once did. You have tried to stay positive. You have tried to plan your way through it. You have tried to convince yourself that if you just worked harder, worried less, or waited longer, things would finally make sense. But according to Carl Jung, the moment life begins to feel uncertain is often the moment the deeper transformation finally begins. The psyche does not destroy structures without purpose. It dismantles what can no longer contain who you are becoming. What feels like collapse is often the beginning of psychological rebirth. The tragedy is that most people panic during this stage because the ego interprets uncertainty as failure, but the soul interprets it as preparation. We live in a culture that fears silence. Every empty space must be filled. Every unanswered question must be solved immediately, and every delay is treated like proof that something has gone wrong. Jung saw this differently. He believed that periods of confusion were not meaningless interruptions in life, but necessary stages in the process of individuation. In alchemy, a substance must first pass through fire before it can be transformed. Jung used this image constantly because he understood that the human psyche develops in exactly the same way. There comes a period when the old identity begins to burn away. The mask you spent years building starts cracking. The ambitions that once motivated you suddenly feel hollow. Relationships that once felt permanent become unstable. During this stage, people often believe they are losing themselves, when in reality, they are finally beginning to encounter themselves for the first time. The ego experiences this as chaos because the ego wants certainty and control. But the deeper self is not interested in preserving comfort. It is interested in truth. And truth usually arrives disguised as disruption. Think about the moments in your life that changed you the most. They probably did not begin with clarity. They began with loss, confusion, disappointment, or isolation. Jung understood that transformation rarely announces itself in beautiful language. More often, it enters through collapse. The psyche withdraws energy from the external world and redirects it inward. This is why you suddenly lose interest in things that once consumed your attention. It is why the noise of the world begins to feel exhausting. Your soul is trying to reclaim energy that has been scattered across expectations, performances, and false identities. Imagine an arrow being pulled backward before it flies forward. The backward movement looks like retreat, but it is actually preparation for distance. Your life may feel like it is moving in reverse right now, but the psyche often pulls inward before it expands outward. Jung believed that when the unconscious begins reorganizing itself, the conscious mind temporarily loses its sense of direction. That is why this period feels so uncomfortable. The map your ego depended on no longer works, yet the new path has not fully revealed itself. You are standing between identities, between worlds, between the person you had to become to survive and the person you are now being asked to become in order to live truthfully. This is also the stage where the shadow begins to emerge. Jung's concept of the shadow was not simply about darkness or negativity. The shadow contains every aspect of yourself that was rejected, hidden, or suppressed over the years. It includes your anger, your fear, your ambition, your grief, your vulnerability, and even your unrealized gifts. Many people spend decades constructing a persona designed to gain acceptance from the world. They become agreeable instead of honest, productive instead of fulfilled, polished instead of authentic. But the parts pushed into the unconscious do not disappear. They wait. Eventually, they demand recognition. That demand often arrives through crisis. Suddenly, you become emotionally reactive in ways you do not understand. You feel drawn toward people who awaken uncomfortable emotions inside you. You feel exhausted, pretending to be fine. According to Jung, this is not psychological failure. It is the beginning of integration. The psyche can no longer sustain the split between who you are and who you pretend to be. The frightening part about meeting the shadow is that it destroys the illusion of perfection. You realize you're more complicated than the image you built for others. Yet this is also where real strength begins. Jung once said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The goal of transformation is not perfection. It is wholeness. A person who has integrated their shadow no longer wastes enormous amounts of energy trying to appear flawless. They stop running from their own complexity. They become grounded because they are no longer divided against themselves. Think about how exhausting it is to constantly suppress emotion, hide vulnerability, or deny anger. The energy required to maintain a false identity eventually drains the spirit. But when the shadow is acknowledged, that trapped energy becomes available again. What once appeared as weakness becomes depth. What once appeared as emotional instability becomes emotional honesty. What once looked like failure becomes the beginning of authenticity. This is why so many people experience a strange emptiness before a major transformation. The old persona is dying, but the new identity has not fully formed. Jung compared this process to alchemy, because the old structure must dissolve before something stronger can emerge. Consider the caterpillar inside the cocoon. Before becoming a butterfly, it does not simply grow wings. It dissolves into an unrecognizable state. If you looked inside midway through the process, it would appear ruined. But nature understands what the ego does not. Dissolution is not the opposite of transformation. It is part of transformation. The same thing happens psychologically. There are periods when your old motivations disappear, your certainty collapses, and your emotional defenses stop functioning. During these moments, people often try to rush back into old identities because uncertainty feels unbearable. They distract themselves with noise, relationships, overworking, or endless productivity. But Jung warned that escaping the process only prolongs suffering. The psyche cannot evolve while the ego keeps rebuilding the same prison. One of the strangest things that happens during deep transformation is the appearance of synchronicity. Jung described synchronicity as meaningful coincidence. Events that appear random on the surface suddenly feel connected to your inner state. You think about someone moments before hearing from them. You encounter symbols, conversations, or repeated patterns that feel uncannily personal. The rational mind dismisses these experiences as coincidence, but Jung believed they revealed a deeper relationship between psyche and reality. During periods of transformation, the unconscious begins communicating through symbols because ordinary logic is no longer sufficient. The soul speaks symbolically. This is why certain dreams suddenly feel profound. It is why specific songs, numbers, animals, or encounters seem charged with emotional meaning. The psyche is attempting to guide you toward alignment. Most people ignore these moments because they are searching for certainty instead of meaning. But synchronicity is not meant to control your future. It is meant to remind you that your life possesses hidden coherence, even when your conscious mind cannot yet perceive it. There is another painful truth Jung understood that modern culture rarely accepts. Real transformation takes time. We compare our timelines to everyone else and assume delay means failure. We see other people moving quickly through careers, relationships, and achievements while we feel stuck in uncertainty. But Jung believed the psyche develops according to depth, not speed. Some lives are built quickly because they are meant to remain shallow. Others take longer because they are constructing stronger foundations. Think about an oak tree compared to a weed. The weed grows rapidly but collapses easily. The oak spends years developing roots before its height becomes visible. From the outside, this looks like delay, but the delay is what allows it to endure storms. Your life may feel slow because your psyche is building something that requires depth instead of temporary validation. Every disappointment has been shaping your character. Every collapse has been stripping away false structures. Every period of silence has been forcing you inward so you could discover what actually belongs to you. Many people misinterpret this stage and become bitter. They look back at years they believe were wasted, relationships that ended, jobs that drained them, dreams that never materialized. But Jung would ask you to look deeper. What if those experiences were not meaningless detours? What if they were necessary confrontations with what you're not? Every false path eventually narrows the psyche toward authenticity. Every disappointment removes another illusion. The problem is that the ego only values experiences that produce immediate external results. The soul values experiences that produce internal evolution. There are lessons that cannot be learned through success alone. Compassion often grows through suffering. Boundaries grow through betrayal. Wisdom grows through uncertainty. Psychological maturity grows through confrontation with limitation. The person you are becoming could not have emerged without the fire that shaped you. This is why your scars matter. Modern culture encourages people to hide every sign of struggle. We edit our pain, conceal our grief, and perform in vulnerability. Jung rejected this entirely. He believed brokenness contained enormous psychological value because the places where we crack are often the places where consciousness enters. A person who has never confronted darkness usually lacks depth. They may appear confident, but their identity remains fragile because it depends entirely on external validation. Someone who has survived the wilderness develops gravity. They stop seeking approval from everyone around them because they have already survived something more difficult than rejection. This is what gives psychologically mature people a certain presence. Their confidence is not performance. It is rooted in experience. They know who they are because life forced them to confront themselves directly. Jung often spoke about the wounded healer. He observed that people who face their own suffering honestly become capable of guiding others through darkness, not because they are perfect, but because they understand complexity. They no longer divide humanity into simple categories of good and bad, strong and weak. They understand contradiction because they have experienced it inside themselves. This is why your struggle may eventually become meaningful far beyond your personal story. The pain you survive often becomes the language through which you later help others survive their own. The people who carried genuine wisdom rarely gained it from comfort. They earned it by staying conscious inside difficulty instead of collapsing into bitterness or denial. At some point in this process, a profound shift begins to occur. The ego gradually realizes it cannot control everything. This is terrifying at first because the ego measures safety through certainty. But Jung believed real transformation begins when the ego stops trying to dominate the psyche and learns to cooperate with the deeper self. The ego is only a small part of who you are. It is the conscious identity you use to navigate daily life. But beneath it exists the unconscious, an immense psychological reality far older and larger than conscious thought. Most people spend their lives believing the ego should control everything. Jung argued the opposite. The ego must eventually surrender its illusion of mastery so the deeper self can guide the process of individuation. This surrender is not weakness. It is alignment. You stop forcing outcomes that no longer belong to you. You stop chasing identities that no longer fit. You stop demanding certainty before taking the next step. Instead, you begin listening. You pay attention to intuition, emotion, dreams, synchronicities, and the quiet inner movements the ego once ignored. Life begins feeling less like a battle for control and more like participation in something meaningful. The anxiety of constantly trying to manage every outcome slowly decreases because you realize the psyche possesses its own intelligence. There is a deeper order unfolding beneath the confusion. When this shift happens, you also stop defining your worth through external achievement alone. The modern world teaches people to worship productivity, status, and perfection. But Jung believed a meaningful life emerges through inner integration rather than endless performance. The goal is not becoming impressive. The goal is becoming whole. A person who knows themselves deeply no longer needs constant applause because their center of gravity has moved inward. They stop abandoning themselves to gain approval. They stop apologizing for their emotional truth. They stop performing identities that drain the soul. This is the stage where many people finally begin experiencing peace, not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because they are no longer fighting themselves. The war between persona and shadow starts dissolving. The split between outer image and inner truth begins healing. You realize that your value was never dependent on whether the world understood you immediately. The delay was not punishment. The confusion was not abandonment. The silence was not emptiness. Everything was preparing you to become someone capable of carrying your own life consciously. And eventually, you look back at the chaos differently. You begin recognizing patterns that once felt meaningless. You see how certain endings protected you from smaller futures. You see how certain delays forced you to develop emotionally before receiving what you thought you wanted. You see how pain carved out depth inside you that comfort never could have created. The tragedy you once cursed becomes part of the architecture that built your character. This is the retrospective miracle Jung understood so deeply. The psyche often reveals meaning only after transformation has already occurred. So, if your life currently feels uncertain, do not rush to interpret that uncertainty as failure. Some of the most important psychological processes happen invisibly. Roots grow underground long before branches appear in the light. The soul reorganizes itself quietly before external reality reflects the change. Your task right now is not to force certainty. It is to remain conscious during the transformation, to stay present inside the fire without rebuilding the old prison out of fear. You're not falling apart randomly. Something deeper is trying to emerge through the collapse of who you once believed you had to be. The silence is not empty. The delays are not meaningless. The wilderness is not punishment. Your psyche is trying to guide you toward a life that belongs to your soul rather than your survival patterns. And one day, you will understand why everything had to unfold exactly the way it did. The miracle was never simply the life you wanted. The miracle was the person you had to become in order to live it consciously. That is the real transformation Jung spent his entire life trying to explain. Not the creation of a perfect human being, but the birth of an integrated one, someone capable of standing inside both light and shadow without abandoning themselves, someone no longer terrified of silence because they have learned to hear the deeper intelligence speaking through it, someone who understands that meaning is not found by escaping suffering, but by allowing suffering to transform consciousness. And perhaps that is why this message found you now. Because some part of you already knows the old version of your life cannot continue. Some part of you recognizes that beneath the confusion, something sacred is being rebuilt. You're not late. You're not broken beyond repair. You are in the middle of becoming. And becoming always feels disorienting before it feels meaningful. But the deeper self already knows where this path leads, even when the conscious mind still sees only darkness ahead. Trust the process enough to keep walking. The person waiting for you at the end of this transformation is not a stranger. It is the most complete version of yourself you have ever known.